severities on our children, on our grandchildren, and actually on all of humanity, believe it or not. It's not just a war on America. They're also waging war on the Europeans and the Chinese and the Africans and just about everybody else. And believe it or not, they're waging war against God. And I know that sounds really ridiculous, right? How dumb would you have to be to wage war on God? But there are people who are doing it. And so today I'm going to talk about a few of the strands of this war. I mean, I could talk to you guys for weeks about this, but I'm going to focus on a few issues that I think will give you the big picture of what's going on here. They seem kind of unrelated at first, so we'll talk about dumbed down education, what's happening in the government schools. The climate hoax, sustainable development. Actually, Armando is going to be giving a whole talk on that. This regionalization process where all these countries, actually I guess you guys saw the Brexit news, so this is really wonderful news, kind of a chink in the armor of this regionalization process. But it is part of this war that I'm talking about. And if we have time, we'll talk a little bit about the corrupt monetary system and the Federal Reserve, and then finally some solutions for how we might deal with this big problem. So, Crimes of the Educators, this is a book that I co-wrote with Dr. Sam Blumenfeld. We have I call it the evidence table in the back, so if you guys want to learn more about any of the things that I'm talking about, you can just walk back there, pick up a copy of the book or some of the magazines. All of the issues that I'm going to be talking about today, I have written very extensively on, so that's kind of why I chose these specific issues to talk about, even though we could have talked about so many other things. But this book here, what Dr. Blumenfeld and I did, he spent 50 years researching on education. He wrote 11 books on education, and he actually died last year. He passed away last year. But it was really an honor and a pleasure to work with him. What he exposed throughout his career was I guess a lot of things, but the primary thing was that the reading methodology that they're using in the schools is actually designed to produce illiteracy. And I realized that when you first hear that, that sounds so ridiculous. But when you see the evidence, I think you will be firmly convinced, and actually the evidence is all around us. I mean, just talking to people, look at the government's own reports about literacy. So let's take a look at this. Some of the crimes that we identify in the book, the first and most serious one is, of course, treason, child abuse, contributing to the delinquency of a minor, destroying children's belief in biblical religion. And they do this all on purpose. You know, they pretend to be neutral. But of course, this is all on purpose, what's happening in the schools. It's not by accident, as we'll see. And then, of course, drug pushing, right? They mess up the children, and then they tell them that they need to put them on hardcore amphetamines and psychotropic drugs to deal with the problems that the schools cause. And then fraud and extortion, right? If a businessman told you that he was going to sell you a product that did something, and then the product did the opposite, you would be pretty upset. That person would have committed fraud. You would take them to court. But that's what the schools are doing. They're taking our money, they're saying they're going to educate our children, and then they're doing the opposite. They're dumbing them down, and they're producing illiteracy and all these other crimes. So you don't have to take my word for it. In 1983, President Reagan put together a commission on education. And, you know, bureaucratic commissions don't usually use intense language, but this is some pretty intense language. So they said that if an unfriendly foreign power had imposed this education system on us, we might well have viewed it as an act of war. So that's a pretty serious charge right there, right? Does it make it any better if domestic forces impose this? I would say not. But they also said that this educational mess threatens our future as a nation and as a people. So this is some pretty serious stuff here. Is our future as a nation and as a people threatened by this education system? I would argue that it is. And I would argue that it was an act of war. You know, just because it wasn't foreigners who did it doesn't make it any less an act of war. So early Americans were very, very well educated. You know, with the exception of slaves, pretty much everybody was literate. Everybody needed to know how to read because they needed to know how to read the Bible and the Constitution and the local newspaper. It was just obvious that you needed to learn how to read. Here's one of the early reading books, the New England Primer, filled with biblical information and scripture and all kinds of useful things. If you go back and look at the very first education law, the old Deluder-Satan Act, everybody needed to know how to read because everybody needed to know the Bible. And if you didn't know the Bible, then Satan could come around and trick you and deceive you and get up to no good. And so, of course, you need to learn how to read. So that was the point of this act. It was in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, obviously, a very long time ago. Today, the situation is just hard to believe. According to the federal government, they did a survey in 1993, 55% of Americans can barely read. So they had 5 categories of reading. 1 and 2 were the worst. 55% of Americans fall in the bottom 2. according to a recent state education agency report, 2/3 of Washington, D.C. residents are functionally illiterate. So these people go to school for 12, 15 years, and they're graduating without being able to read their high school diploma. What's wrong here? I taught a 4-year-old how to read in a few weeks. So something is going on here. They're spending $1 trillion, and these people are graduating and they can't read. That's crazy, and it's deliberate. So, OECD rankings were 27th in math. SAT scores have been declining since we got the SAT, really. So this has been a long-term process. What they do is they recenter the test every 10 years to conceal the dumbing down, but it's happening. If you look at some of the tests that were used around the turn of the century, in the early 1900s, late 1800s, you wouldn't believe it. I mean, college graduates today wouldn't even be able to begin on these tests. So we are getting dumber and dumber and dumber, and it's by design. So how did this happen? Well, Horace Mann contributed a lot to it. Now, we don't know much about his motives, but he was the first Secretary of Education for Massachusetts. We didn't have a U.S. education department back then, but he went to Prussia, and the Prussian government had implemented this statist system that was designed to indoctrinate children into statism, and he brought that over here to the United States, first to Massachusetts, and then he went around trying to spread that to other states. We're going to stop here. This is one of the most important things. If you come away with anything from this talk, I want you to pay attention to what I'm saying here, because this is crucial. The whole word versus the phonics method. So this is how they brought about all this illiteracy. Horace Mann was actually the first to try this. We don't know what his intentions were, but he was the first to try it. He put it in the public schools in Boston, and it was such a disaster that they yanked it out after a few years. But then it was resurrected by John Dewey, who we'll meet in a minute. But what they do here, I mean, I could talk about this again for a week, but just to kind of summarize it, the whole word method, what they're doing to these children is teaching them to read English as if it were Chinese. So if you see this little picture here, you have a fish, picture of a fish, and then it says fish under it. So they teach the children to look at this weird combination of squiggly lines and realize that that means fish, rather than teaching them that an F makes a F sound and an I makes a F sound. So I realize that sounds ridiculous to anyone who learned how to read the proper way, where they teach you the sound of the letters and how to combine the letters. But this is what they're doing in government schools across the country. They're teaching children to read English as if it were Chinese. This produces lifelong disabilities, produces what I call whole word dyslexia. So people who can't read, they call it dyslexia. They say it's a genetic thing or a mysterious thing. It's not. It's caused by the way that they're teaching reading in the schools. And modern neuroscience can actually show this. You can do brain scans on children who are learning how to read using this quack method, and you see that the brain gets all wired wrong, the wrong hemisphere is trying to do the wrong thing. We have a phonetic alphabet, so of course you need to teach that using phonics. And again, I taught a 4-year-old how to read in a matter of weeks. It's not a hard thing to do. The government's spending $1 trillion a year, and they're producing people who can't even read their high school diploma, and it's on purpose. So. This is huge. If you have children in government schools, make sure you teach them how to read before the government schools can damage them, because this is a huge problem. So what happens if you can't read? Well, you can't read your Bible, you can't read your Constitution, you can't read your history books, you can't read your science books. You are basically helpless. You need to rely on the government schools and on the television to learn anything about anything, and that is by design. So, here's John Dewey. This is the man most responsible for getting this quackery into the schools across the country. We're going to have to really speed through this presentation. I realize there's a lot of stuff we're not talking about, and maybe you guys see it on the slides. But first of all, he was a socialist, and he was a very open socialist. He never bothered to hide it. He went to the Soviet Union and helped Lenin with his schools over there. Thought we should do that kind of stuff here. He pointed to a specific model that he wanted to see in America, 1888 by Edward Bellamy. It was basically a fantasy about a communist America. The book was called Looking Backward. And no private property, everybody loved the collective, everybody sacrificed themselves for the good of the collective. In fairness to John Dewey, he didn't have the last 100 years that we have to look at and say, whoa, everywhere socialism is tried, it results in starvation, slaughter, torture, terror, and 100, 200 million dead people. So in fairness to Dewey, he didn't know exactly necessarily what this would cost. But this was his ideology, this is what he wanted. He was also a humanist. One of the first humanists. He was actually a signer of the first Humanist Manifesto, and you'll see why the philosophy of the government schools, why the religion of the government schools is incompatible with the values of America. So here's the first Humanist Manifesto, which he signed. He wanted this in all the schools. First, religious humanists regard the universe as self-existing and not created. Does anybody remember the first words of the Bible? In the beginning, God created the... Right, so these are not compatible, right? These are fundamentally opposed to each other from the very start. This is the religion that's in the schools. So if there's any Christians in here, this is the religion that's being taught to your children. You know, we can keep going. They also talk about we need to abolish private property, we need to collectivize, and you know, everybody recognizes that as socialist poppycock. But that's what he wanted anyway. And he was also a self-styled educator. He actually outlined this plan. He wanted to take out reading, take out math from the early years. He thought we should focus on socializing the children so they would become good little socialists like they were doing over in the USSR. And he wrote The Primary Education Fetish, an essay in 1898. We published it in the book because it's so important. He basically says change must come gradually because to force it unduly would compromise its final success by favoring a violent reaction. So, you know, why would it favor a violent reaction? Why, if people knew what he was doing, they would react violently. Why? Well, I think it's pretty clear when you look at his writings, when you look at his agenda. Because he was trying to dumb down the students, he was trying to erode their literacy, trying to erode their faith, so he could build this socialist, humanist utopia. He was waging war on the foundations of our country, on our constitutional form of government, on the biblical foundations of this country. And he was doing it very deliberately. He wanted to do it quietly and secretly because there would be a violent reaction. So that's you know, pretty big admission right there. He got lots of millions of dollars from the Rockefeller interests. They had the General Education Board, one of their philanthropies. So they funded this quackery. And you know, the Bible says, judge things by their fruits. Well, what are the fruits of today's education system? Well, there you go. So again, we're going to kind of have to speed through this stuff. But yeah, central element of his plan was this whole word method that we talked about a moment ago. He resurrected this failed system. It had been so thoroughly debunked when Horace Mann put it in the schools in Boston. The headmasters of Boston got together and put together a paper and said, this is the most ridiculous thing in the universe. Get it out of the schools immediately. You're turning the children into illiterates. So Dewey said that'll be perfect. And he got it implemented in schools across the country. Him and his cohorts took over the teaching colleges at Columbia University and the University of Chicago. They produced, some of you are probably familiar with these, the Dick and Jane reading program came out of the University of Chicago, teaches this look, say, whole word, sight method, quackery. And then, of course, there was the Macmillan reading program from the Teachers College at Columbia. That's a key institution. And from there, they sent out so-called educators to take over all the teaching colleges and basically create what we have today, what we call the government school system. So there's the Dewey Plan. Anyways, it didn't really go too far until after World War II, when all the schools had all this money after the war. You know, they weren't wasting and spending it all on war and other things, so they said, okay, well now we can buy all the new Dewey books and implement this. Now the quackery was first actually exposed in 1955, so this is not a new revelation. Rudolf Flesch exposed it and what it was doing and why Johnny can't read. He said that the teaching of reading in the schools flies in the face of all logic. So this has been an ongoing debate for a long time, and yet it's continued to be taught in the schools. So we got the feds in the classroom in 1965. They kind of got the camel's nose under the tent by saying, we'll give you some federal funding for certain things. And that's how they seized control of education nationally and implemented this crazy regime that has culminated in Common Core. Here we have, this is a pretty interesting graph from the Cato Institute. There you have the cost, that blue line that's sloping upwards, federal spending on education. Down there you have the test scores, so they're not going anywhere, right? Actually, the test scores are even a little bit misleading because if you look at all the objective measures, we're going down, 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 down. So they're spending more and more money, we're getting dumber and dumber. What is going on here? Common Core I'm not going to talk about too much because we have Dr. Karen Ephraim who will talk about this later on in the afternoon. And UNESCO. So UNESCO is a big part of this global agenda, this war on America, this war on humanity. UNESCO is basically the wannabe global education ministry. It was openly founded for the purpose of promoting socialism and humanism through education. If that sounds familiar, it's John Dewey's program. The first Secretary General of the institution said the goal was political unification in some sort of world government. They said schools, in 1949, they said schools should be used to combat family attitudes. So your kids went to government school, they hate God, they hate you. What happened? Well, there you go, they told us what happened, right? They're running programs right this instant. Education for sustainable development, education for world citizenship, all these wonderful things. Bill Gates, the financier of Common Core, put $2 billion into Common Core. He signed a deal with UNESCO to develop a master curriculum for the teachers. So they're pushing sexual education from age 4 all around the world. They have guidelines for all the schools. They push the whole word methods, believe it or not, at the global level. Humanism, multiculturalism, all that great stuff. They also have a World Core curriculum, believe it or not, and they openly tell you that they want this in every school in the world. So this World Core curriculum was developed by Robert Mueller. He dedicated the standards, believe it or not, to Alice Bailey. So Alice Bailey was the founder of Lucifer Publishing Company. I kid you not, I encourage you all to look it up yourselves. And she was a really weird lady. She said these spirit masters would come into her and give her information to write all these bizarre books, Education in the New Age, and all kinds of craziness. So that's who the standards are dedicated to, that they want to get in every school in the world. So this core has to teach the child to see him or herself as a part of the greater whole, right? So it sounds like Castro rhetoric. And the current head of UNESCO is actually an actual communist from the Bulgarian Communist Party. The People's Republic of Bulgaria murdered 222,000 people out of the population of 7 million, according to statistics in Democide, the best tracking of how many people have died at the hands of government. So that's who you would, of course, put in charge of the global education ministry. And they're about to put her in charge of the United Nations, the whole United Nations. Pretty interesting. And then Arne Duncan, Obama's education secretary for just until a few months ago. He says UNESCO is his global partner, and he brags about how the schools are going to teach your kids to be green global citizens, and he says education is a weapon to change the world, and he's not kidding. Armando's going to talk about sustainable development, but here's this quote to whet your appetite. Generally, more highly educated people who have higher incomes consume more resources than poorly educated people who tend to have lower incomes. In this case, more education increases the threat to sustainability. So if your kids become educated, they're not going to be sustainable, right, is what the United Nations is telling you here. So they don't want your kids educated, they want your kids dumb. So we'll talk a little bit about the global warming hoax. We'll kind of speed through this. In the 60s and up until the 1980s, actually, they were warning about global cooling. We're all going to die from man-made global cooling. In Newsweek in 1975, had a big article, The Cooling World, man-made global cooling is going to kill us all. They said climatologists are pessimistic that the government is going to do something to save us from global cooling. Some of the solutions they had, they wanted to cover the Arctic ice cap with black suits so they could melt it. Really, I mean, now they're saying that it's melting, it's actually not, but they wanted to melt it back then. Obama's science czar today, actually, John Holdren, we'll talk about him in a minute too. He was an advocate of global cooling theory. He said man-made CO2 emissions were going to lead to a global ice age that was going to kill 1 billion people. And so the solution back then, global government, forced abortions, drugging the water supply. He wrote all this in his own book, actually, Ecoscience, you can check it out. And the solution today to global warming, surprise, is the exact same thing as the solution to global cooling. Global government, global taxes, sterilizing, abortion, unbelievable stuff. Here's from Newsweek, the global cooling article. So now the new scare, of course, is global warming, right? I'm sure you guys have heard that. They say we're all doomed, and actually all their predictions have been just as ridiculous. There's a few articles you can go check at the evidence table. I looked through all the predictions that these people have been making. We're going to die by this year, this is going to be underwater. They're always wrong. It's like God has a sense of humor or something. You know, they say something, so he's got to prove them wrong. It's brilliant. So in Antarctica, you know, they said Antarctica was melting, all that. NASA says it's not. Actually, it's growing at a humongous rate. You can't believe it. Record levels of sea ice. There's the global warming stuck. They went to go study global warming in the summer, and they got their boat stuck in ice, funny enough. So they had to rescue them with fossil fuels, right? They had to fly in helicopters, and it was good. Oh, my graph messed up again, and I thought I had fixed it, but I guess not. But I have a graph here. This is all you need to know that the global warming theory is false. They had 73 computer models in the UN report, the IPCC report, about what was going to happen in global temperatures as CO2 levels increased. CO2, of course, is the gas of life, right? You can kind of see the graph there. The blue line and the green line is what actually happened. The red line is the average of the UN's predictions. Every one of the 73 models predicted accelerated warming. We've actually had no warming in almost 20 years now, according to the indisputable satellite record and the weather balloon record. So unless you're using their manipulated surface statistics, which a lot of them actually, they just plug in data where they don't have any data, they manipulate, they admit they manipulate. If you use the actual, unmanipulated record from the satellites, which is by far the best data, there has been no warming in close to 20 years. That red line right there is what the UN predicted. So all of their models were wrong. Literally, a monkey with some dice rolling in would have had an infinitely better track record of predicting what would happen in global temperatures than the UN and their silly climate models. So there you go, their theory is wrong. Their hypothesis was that the Earth would warm as CO2 increased. CO2 increased, the Earth did not warm. So now they have excuses, right? Obama says the ocean ate my global warming. We found out through leaks that he told the United Nations to put that in their latest report, but nobody's buying it. Here's some just interesting. The Vikings actually, they used to live over on Greenland, and they used to farm there way back when it was a lot warmer than it is today. Of course, today you can't farm on Greenland, right? There's some of their old churches. They had to leave after it got too cold. So carbon dioxide. This is the gas of life, right? They're calling it pollution. So you exhale carbon dioxide. Every one of you, when you're taking a breath, that's carbon dioxide coming out. Now they're telling you that that is pollution and that you need to pay a tax for emitting that pollution. Believe it or not. There is no activity that you could possibly do, including laying in your bed, that does not produce CO2. So if we give the United Nations the power to regulate and tax CO2, they will control everything. So, and actually Earth is starving for more CO2, believe it or not. That's why farmers who have greenhouses, they pump CO2 into the greenhouses. Plants love CO2. And you probably learned in second grade, science class, plants need CO2, humans emit CO2. So, they say that's pollution, and of course they would, right? What better tool to attack our liberties and our freedom and everything else? If you want to learn more about these things, actually I've been following the UN around to their little global warming conferences for a number of years now. It's good fun. There's some articles we did about it in the New American Magazine back there on the evidence table. I was at the Paris summit in December where they got their global warming treaty that Trump said he was going to get us out of. It's actually not even a treaty. It's not going to be presented to the Senate. But if you want to learn more about that, the special issue should be back there on the evidence table. So the real agenda here is, of course, first of all, to undermine national sovereignty, right? If there's this global menace, that CO2, that we need to get rid of, well, it transcends borders. So only the UN is capable of dealing with this global menace, right? So they need power over the gas of life. And so the real agenda here is crushing sovereignty. And they actually told us, the Club of Rome, a very influential group of globalists and communists, came together in 1991. They said they needed a new enemy to unite us, right? The Soviet Union had supposedly collapsed. And so they came up with this idea of pollution and global warming. So they said the real enemy then is humanity. That's you guys. You guys are the real enemy, right? Of course, another part of the real agenda is seizing control of the global economy. They haven't really hidden this. Here's the UN's climate czar, Christiana Figueres from Costa Rica. She says that it must be understood that what's occurring here in the whole climate change process is a complete transformation of the economic structure of the world. So they're not really hiding it, right? They don't tell you on the front page of the New York Times, but they do tell you, here's the Prime Minister of India, justice demands that whatever CO2 we can still burn be allowed to be burned by developing countries. So how much CO2 is left for you guys to burn? But none, right? Because it all should be burned by developing countries. So that's the agenda. They're going to destroy our economy under the guise of solving a non-problem and transfer all the wealth down to the third world dictatorships and, of course, the United Nations. Here's one of the UN's chief scientists. You have to understand that what's happening here with climate policy is actually international wealth redistribution, and he told you that. And then, of course, they want to take away our liberties, right? And so what better tool than saying that the gas you exhale is pollution that needs to be regulated and controlled. This comes with a multifaceted thing. Now you see the state attorneys general are trying to prosecute climate skeptics. But really, I mean, if we buy the idea that CO2 is pollution, we have handed over control over every aspect of human life, the economy, civilization, everything. So sustainability, Armando will talk about this. This poster, I went to the 2012 Rio Plus 20 Summit in Rio de Janeiro, the UN Sustainable Development Summit, and this poster was just burned into my mind forever. So there's a little Earth there, you can see he's sick, he's got the thermometer coming out, and the doctor comes in and says, you have humans. So humans are a disease, right? And what do you do with a disease? Well, you eradicate it, right? You don't like diseases, you try to get rid of them. And humans, you guys, all of us are a disease. It's just amazing. Here's Obama's science czar. I talked about him in the nut job. He wrote in his little book, Eco-Science, that we need a planetary regime. He wanted to put sterilizing agents in the water supply so that you couldn't have children. He believed forced abortions could be sustained under our American Constitution, believe it or not. His word was planetary regime to control all the resources. So that probably does not sound like fun to most people, but that's what they're going for. There's Maurice Strong. UN Agenda 2030, I think Armando will get into this too, but this is the UN's plan for global government. Actually, they call it the Declaration of Interdependence. It calls for national and international wealth redistribution, a war on carbon dioxide. It's going to heal Mother Earth, right? Isn't that nice? And it's going to cost trillions of dollars with a T. The Chinese and actually some of the Europeans are calling it the next great leap forward. For history students, you probably recognize the term, right? The last one, we lost about 40 million lives in the last great leap forward. Innocent people murdered and starved to death by the Communist Chinese government. But it's only going to be possible to have this great leap forward if wealth is shared, inequality is addressed, everyone needs to have equal rights to economic resources, right? That language should sound very familiar. They're going to achieve universal health coverages, vaccines for all, mental health, abortions for everyone, and of course they're targeting children. They tell you right in there. Children and young women and men are critical agents of change. They're going to channel their activism into these goals, and by 2030, this is right in the agenda, by 2030, all learners, so they global education here, right? All learners need to have the knowledge and skills to promote sustainable development. We already saw briefly what sustainable development is. You'll learn more from Armando. But all children need to know this, right? And they need to believe in it, and they need to promote it. How are we doing on time, I wonder? I believe 60 minutes left. All right, so we'll kind of speed through here the refugee crisis, so-called. First of all, I think it's important to know that these guys actually caused this crisis, right? They destroyed Libya, they destroyed Syria, they destroyed Iraq, they destroyed Afghanistan, and then they said, oh, we destroyed your countries, why don't you guys all come to ours, and we'll put you up in a house and pay, and won't that be nice, right? So this was engineered from the start. People like George Soros, people like Barack Obama, destroyed these countries on purpose, based on lies, based on UN resolutions, and then they invited all the angry people whose houses they bombed to come to our houses at taxpayer expense. So, it wasn't that nice of a humanitarian. You also have ISIS running around, right? ISIS, nobody likes ISIS. ISIS is no fun. But what is ISIS actually? Well, according to Obama's top officials, ISIS is actually a creation of Obama's anti-ISIS coalition. And I kid you not, you can go on YouTube and find Biden talking about how Obama's anti-ISIS coalition created and funded and armed ISIS. So here's Biden. I know they call him the impeachment insurance, right, because he has a tendency to say dumb things and whatnot. But he says there was no moderate middle in Syria, right? We were arming jihadists, and he admits there was no moderate middle. That was just a lie. So the people who were being supplied al-Nusra and Al-Qaeda, right? And these guys eventually became ISIS. He says right there, all of a sudden everybody's awakened because this outfit called ISIL, which was Al-Qaeda in Iraq, blah, 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 and we could not convince our colleagues to stop supplying them. So who's he talking about? Well, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, all these anti-ISIS coalition members. So isn't that nice? And of course, he's minimizing the role of the State Department and the CIA, which also played a big, big part in this. Here's General Dempsey, who at the time was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Senator Lindsey Graham asked him, so, he was trying to be smart. So, do you know of any of our allies who are supporting ISIS? And he actually responded, he was under oath, he couldn't lie. He said, actually, I know some of our allies who are funding ISIS. So, I'll do you one better. There you go. Driving some nice pickup trucks paid for by U.S. taxpayers. I'm sure ISIS is very thankful. And they knew this was going to happen. This wasn't an accident. They're not stupid. Actually, I have a 2012 Defense Intelligence Agency memo from the Pentagon. You can go look this up yourself. It was declassified in a lawsuit by Judicial Watch. They said, the Salafists, this is kind of fundamentalist radical Islam, the Muslim Brotherhood and Al-Qaeda in Iraq are the major forces driving the insurgency in Syria. So remember, we were supporting the insurgency in Syria. Obama said we were supporting moderate rebels and blah, blah, blah. The West, so Obama, the European Union, etc., the Gulf countries, the Islamic dictatorship, and Turkey support the Syrian opposition. And we know who the Syrian opposition is, Muslim Brotherhood, Al-Qaeda. And there is the possibility of establishing a declared or undeclared principality in eastern Syria, and that is exactly what the supporting powers to the opposition want. So what did they want? The principality based on fundamentalist Islam in eastern Syria. Today we call it the Islamic State, or ISIS. Hillary Clinton got this email, so they knew they're not stupid, they did it on purpose. Why? I don't know. Ask yourself that question. Here's McCain with his little jihad buddies. So we're actually helping all the different sides, believe it or not. We're supporting the Iraqi military, which is helping Assad, the dictator. We're supporting the radical jihadists, the ISIS, the Al-Qaeda, who are trying to fight the dictator. And we're supporting the communists, the Kurdish Workers' Party, and so on. A lot of these are designated terrorist organizations, yet our tax dollars are supporting them anyway. Why? Right? Well, it's made a big mess, and millions of people have packed up and left, and they're heading for Europe, and they're heading for the United States, and of course they're very angry. According to the UN, about 3/4 of the refugees into Europe are men. It's weird, right? How many of you men would leave your wife and kids in a war zone and go to Europe? I don't know. More than 90% of the unaccompanied minors are male. A lot of them say they're 16, 17, they're actually 25, 28. And the tsunami is growing every day, right? They're expecting millions more people. Obama's flying them over here with the help from the UN as quick as he can. The jihadist who shot up the club in Orlando, he actually worked for a Homeland Security contractor that was picking up illegal immigrants at the border, driving them into the United States, dropping them off with no papers, saying bye-bye. So something fishy is going on here, right? Europe is on the brink. Actually, it's out of control. I just spent about 8 months in Europe, in Sweden. We drove all the way down to Portugal. All lies. It's absolutely crazy. Check out the evidence table if you want more. Here's Gaddafi. Actually, he was a terror war ally for a long time until Obama turned on him and decided to back Al-Qaeda. And he was really happy. He said there's 50 million Muslims already in Europe. Maybe Allah is going to grant us victory without even having to use guns and swords and stuff. Isn't that nice? So Obama was also doing the surge. Of course, the UN is really the one behind this whole refugee operation, right? They have the UN High Commissioner for Refugees who chooses which refugees are going to go where. And, surprise, surprise, Christians who make up about 10% of the population of Syria are nowhere to be found among these refugees. Why not? They're the ones who are getting their heads chopped off by the ISIS and by these others. What is going on here? Something very strange, right? So the agenda, just like with the global warming thing, build up global and regional institutions and governance. Here's the Council on Foreign Relations, globalist central here in the United States. They say the EU offers a model for unifying the Middle East, right? So now we've destroyed the Middle East, now we're going to rebuild it with this regional government. And they tell you themselves, this is not a secret. Here's another big globalist. He's a steering committee member on the Bilderberg group, a little secret group of bankers and politicians and stuff. They think they're so great. So he was also a partner with Goldman Sachs, chairman of Goldman Sachs, and he says he wants governments to recognize sovereignty as an illusion. See that? It's an absolute illusion, and it has to be put behind us. The days of hiding behind borders are done, right? We need a better world with no borders, and this is what they're doing. He's the refugee czar, the migration czar for the UN right now, and he told you what he's doing, what the agenda is. So here's George Soros. He says borders are the obstacle, right? Borders are an obstacle. What do you do with obstacles? Try to get around them. Here's the European Union. So really what they're doing is undermining the nation state, right? Who made nations? Does anybody remember at the Tower of Babel, God got a little bit upset. Who made the nations, right? So God made the nations. What are these guys trying to do? To abolish the nations, right? And it's really funny. Here's the European Parliament right there. Probably looks familiar to those of you who know what the Tower of Babel has always been portrayed as, right? There they are side by side. There's an official European Union poster right there. Many tongues, one voice, right? So we're getting rid of the nations, and there's actually some people who are saying this. We have the Hungarian Prime Minister, Viktor Orban. He says the refugee crisis endangers our way of life, our culture, our customs, and our Christian traditions. It's a pre-planned and orchestrated weapon, and it's going to reshape the religious and cultural landscape of Europe, and they're going to eliminate the last barrier to internationalism or to globalism, which is the nation states. So the agenda, of course, is to undermine the nation states, to undermine our liberties. They're using all this terrorism to restrict free speech, to restrict our gun rights, to restrict just about any liberty you can think of. Oh, we invited millions of jihadists into your country after we blew up theirs. Now we need to take away your guns, right? So you see how that works? That's good. Then, are these people humanitarians, right? They're telling us that it's very humanitarian that they're going to be bringing all these refugees to our country. Well, these guys destroyed the countries. So, what kind of humanitarian burns down your house and then invites you into somebody else's house? That's not humanitarianism. You could support 25 to 50 times as many refugees in the countries close by than you could in Europe or in the United States, but for some reason they insist on shipping them to the West. And when that lied, the humanitarianism flopped, they said, well, we need all these new workers because we don't have enough kids, so otherwise we're not going to have enough workers to support the welfare states. That's not true either. Every study that's ever been done shows these people are going to be a burden on the tax system as far as the eye can see. There is no, in 20 years they'll be net contributors. We don't know if they'll ever be net contributors because so far we haven't been able to determine if that will ever happen. We know that they are a big burden on the tax base. So it's not because of jobs, it's not to support the welfare state, and it's not humanitarian. The goal is a new world order, that's their term. And they're basically dividing the world up into these regional governments. You have the African Union, the Eurasian Union is what Putin is building over there in Eurasia. They're building a Middle East Union, they want a North American Union, they have a union of South American states. Of course, the British just gave them a big punch in the nose a few days ago, that was good news. Ban Ki-moon, right there, haven't seen that in a long time, but the apocalypse on cause, right? So Ban Ki-moon, he says that he's the chairman of the Secretary General of the UN. He says the UN is the parliament of humanity. So they're already acting as if the UN is the global government, right? What is a parliament? It's a sovereign institution that makes laws. And they want a global, they already have a global system. They have armies, they have police, they have courts, they have an education ministry, a health ministry, an environmental ministry. They're acting like a government. And of course they want a global currency to be printed by the International Monetary Fund. Here's Henry Kissinger, the New World Order architect. He says the contemporary quest for world order, he means world government, is going to need a coherent strategy to establish government within these various regions, order within these regions, and to relate them to one another. So that's why you see European Union, South American Union, Asian Union, Eurasian Union, African Union, right? All of these little unions. George H.W. Bush told us about them. He went on TV when he was invading Iraq the first time. He said, we want a new world order in which a credible United Nations can use its peacekeeping role, and that's a double speak, right? Peacekeeping role, they really mean military role, to fulfill the promise and vision of the UN's founders. Well, anybody who knows about the UN's founders should be very alarmed by that, right? Our guy, America's representative, was Alger Hiss. He actually went on to be convicted of being a communist Soviet traitor. So he was the first Secretary General of the UN. So our guy, representing us, was a communist spy. Interesting. So that's the UN's founders right there. George Soros says we need a world order, a new world order, and China needs to own the new world order. So who wants a new world order owned by the most brutal communist dictatorship that murdered more people than any other government in all of history? They're going to own the new world order. That'll be fun, huh? This is actually not Ben's secret. This was all out in the open 40, 50, 60 years ago. Here's another book I co-wrote. It's actually just evidence straight from the congressional record. There's not even a lot of our writing in there. It's just evidence straight from the congressional record. These guys introducing bills to form world government, et cetera, et cetera. So why is this all happening? Well, there's a few options, right? It could just be an evolution of historical forces, right? It could be mistakes. Maybe we just have idiots in Washington, D.C., maybe, right? Or it could be deliberate. Did somebody want all of this to be happening? Well, former U.S. Secretary of Defense James Forrestal, he said consistency has never been the mark of stupidity. And he was talking about the policy toward Russia here, but it applies to everything else. If these people were just stupid, occasionally they would make a mistake in our favor, right? But they never, ever do. Harold Quigley, Bill Clinton's mentor, big-time globalist. He loved the idea, actually. He just thought it shouldn't be secret. But he said the goal of these globalists was nothing less than to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. The system was going to be controlled in a feudalist fashion, secret meetings. The apex of the system was going to be a private central bank to oversee the world's central banks, which were themselves private central banks, right? The Federal Reserve is actually a private central bank. The regional Federal Reserve banks are owned by their member banks. It's not a government institution, and they tell you that, they brag about that. So what is this system that he was referring to? Well, the Council on Foreign Relations is its U.S. branch, the Trilateral Commission, set up by David Rockefeller, another important component, the Bilderberg Group, the G20, etc. Here's Hillary Clinton talking about the Council on Foreign Relations. We get a lot of advice from the Council, so this means I won't have to go as far to be told what we should be doing and how we should think about the future. So this was when she was Secretary of State. That's a pretty influential body that tells the Secretary of State how to be thinking and what to be doing about the future. Who are the Council on Foreign Relations? Here's a partial list of names: Nixon, Ford, Carter, Bush, Clinton, Tim Geithner, Volcker, etc. Rupert Murdoch, right? I know that name's a surprise to some. Chairman of Fox News, Rick Warren, Christian Pastor, Katie Couric, Robert Gates. All these big wigs are all buddies of the Council on Foreign Relations. Every administration, Democrat or Republican, has been packed with members of the CFR. There's just the numbers, right? Carter had 284 in his administration. Obama's got 379 plus. There's actually a book on the evidence table, Shadows of Power, written more than 20 years ago, talking about the CFR. It's just as relevant today. It's an excellent book. I highly recommend it. So what are the solutions to this giant mess that we find ourselves in? Well, I would say probably the first and most important, maybe the only, is actually God, right? Without God, we're done for, just put up the white flag, let's go home, and just wait for whatever comes. So we need to be praying. We need to be educating ourselves. We need to be reading our Bible. And the Bible tells us that if my people, which are called by my name, shall humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, I will hear from heaven and forgive their sin and heal their land. So God promised He would heal the land if we did those things, right? So there's the solution right there, in my opinion. Share the good news with others, right? Share the gospel with others. That's, I think, the way we're going to have to stop this, if it's going to be stopped. It's going to be this way. Thank you. So get active in your church, right? Make sure God is not driven out of the public square. Now it's illegal to say God in the schools, right? Why? Whose schools are these? So educate yourself. Read your Bible. Read the Constitution. Read the Declaration of Independence. Learn about economics and theology and philosophy and history and science, and follow the news. And I know not all of us have time to do all those things, but we do need to do those things. That is really going to be the key. You need to educate others. Don't be misled, right? There's a lot of people who will try to mislead you. They say, oh, it's black people who did this, white people who did this, Jewish people who did this. None of those things, right? That's ridiculous. And those are just distractions that don't actually solve any problems. Subscribe to the New American Magazine. It's a great magazine. I write for it, but that's not why it's great. It's just a great magazine. John Birch Society is a really good group, where the state coordinator for Florida is back there. That's Captain John Birch. He was a Baptist missionary who went to China to try to save souls and win people to Christ. He was murdered by the communists. Long story short, he became a military intelligence officer for the U.S. During World War II, and then after World War II ended, the Chinese communists killed him for no reason. So we say he was the first victim of the Cold War, first victim of international communism on the American side. So basically, the mission is to bring about less government, more responsibility, with God's help, a better world. They provide educational materials, right? A lot of the stuff is back there on the evidence table. And they have chapters in all 50 states working together to spread educational materials and knowledge and organized action to solve a lot of these problems. Here's Robert Welch. He was the founder, really smart guy, actually. He said, there is a conspiracy at work as sure as there is a law of gravity. And to try to overcome its effects by ignoring its existence is exactly the kind of opposition that the conspiracy has contrived and created for itself. So we stand solidly on a position that the only way to stop this conspiracy is to expose it. And you might say, oh, conspiracy, that's a bad word. We can't believe the word conspiracy. Well, here's David Rockefeller. He is proud, and he uses the term conspiracy. This is in his book. You can go pick it up at your library if you don't want to give him money. He says, some even believe that we are part of a secret cabal working against the best interests of the United States, conspiring with others around the world to build one world. And he says that if that's the charge, he is guilty, and he is proud of it. So he is proud of conspiring. You know, conspiring means illegal or immoral activity in secret with fellow internationalists around the world against the best interests of his own country. So he told us here. It's not even really a conspiracy anymore because he told us. It's not secret. But there you go. Constitution really is the solution to a lot of America's problems, right? If we go back to the Constitution, the government will shrink. The government's causing all these problems. We get rid of the government doing these problems, and problems go away. We have a lot of tools, right? We don't need to just rely on the Supreme Court. We can nullify things at the state level. We can stop accepting federal money. We can urge Congress to get us out of the United Nations. And so get active, right? Do something. And thanks very much, guys. God bless.